In this video, we're going to look at some rules and strategies to use when working with positive and negative integers. This video is particularly going to focus on adding and subtracting positive and negative integers, where in the next video we're going to have a look at multiplying and dividing positive and negative integers. So, let's begin. First, let's define what an integer is. An integer is a number that is not a fraction. In other words, an integer is a whole number. As you can see here on our number line of integers, an integer can be both positive, here on the right of the zero, and it can also be negative when we go to the left of the zero. Now, adding and subtracting positive integers is easy, as there are only two options. We can either add two positive integers together, or we can subtract two positive integers together. One example of adding two positive integers together can be 5 plus 3. Now on our number line, this tells us that we need to start at 5, which we can locate here. We need to move 3 spaces in the positive direction. So that's 1, 2, 3, and we finish at 8. We can also subtract two positive indices together. So we can take that 5 and subtract positive 3, which we start at our 5 and we move towards the negative direction 3 spaces. So that's 1, 2, 3, and our answer is 2. Now this is fairly simple. However, when we introduce negative integers, it becomes a little bit more complicated. These are all the possible scenarios that we could have when we're adding and subtracting negative integers. Fortunately, you don't have to learn all these combinations. Instead, we're going to learn some simple rules and strategies that will make this process a lot easier. So let's begin by looking at two key rules. The first rule states that when we add a negative, it is the same as subtracting a positive. So let's think about this. If I had $2 and I then added another negative $2, that would be the same as saying I need to subtract this $2 away from me. In terms of maths, this is saying that I have $2 and I'm adding another negative 2 to the problem. Now when we've got this, we can rewrite this plus a negative as 2 subtract 2, which will equal 0. Now, Rule 2 states that subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. So what that means is if I have negative $2, that is the same as owing someone $2. Now if you subtract that negative $2 that I owe away from me, you're essentially adding the $2 so I don't owe anything anymore. In maths, this is the same as subtracting a negative integer. So if I have negative 2 and I subtract that negative 2, this can be rewritten as negative 2 plus 2, which will equal 0. Now that we have our rules, there are 4 scenarios that we could be faced with. We could start with a positive integer and that number could become more positive. The second scenario we could be faced with is starting with a positive integer and that integer becomes more negative. The third scenario, we could start with a negative integer and that value becomes more negative. In the fourth scenario, we could start with a negative integer and that value becomes more positive. Let's take a look at these in a little bit more detail. Our first scenario stated that we started with a positive integer and that value became more positive. So if we start at 5, which on our number line is just here, and we added an extra 3, that would say that we need to move to the right 3 places, which will arrive at 8. However, this same problem can be rewritten as 5 subtract negative 3. Now to solve this problem, we would need to have a look at rule number 2 that says subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. We can rewrite this as 5 add 3, which will bring us to the same problem that we started with. Now, in these types of problems, we're starting in the positive region, and the values are always becoming more positive. What that means is the solutions that we can expect are going to be positive. Our second scenario had us starting at a positive integer and that value becoming more negative. Problems like this could be that we start at 5 and we subtract 3, so our value is becoming more negative. Now if we look at our number line, we start at 5, we would need to move 3 spaces to the left. So it's 1, 2, 3. We arrive at our final answer of 2. Now with problems like this, we can actually keep becoming more negative. So if we subtracted 5 in this case, we would end up with a final answer of 0. If we kept going, say subtracted 7, our final answer would be a negative value. So these sorts of scenarios can have positive solutions, negative solutions, but it can also equal 0. Now this problem can be written in another way. We can rewrite this problem to be 5 plus a negative 3. Now if we bring in rule number 1, that states that adding a negative value is the same as subtracting a positive. So here we're adding a negative value. So we can rewrite this as 5 subtract 3, which is the same problem that we started with. Our third scenario had us starting with a negative integer and that value becoming more negative. One such problem could include starting at negative 5 and then subtracting 3. If we go to our number line, we start at that negative 5 and we go 3 in the negative direction. So it's 1, 2, 3, and our solution will be negative 8. However, we can also rewrite this problem a different way. We can still start at our negative 5 and we can add negative 3 to this problem. Now, if we have a look at rule number 1, rule number 1 says that when we add a negative, it is the same as subtracting a positive. So here we are adding a negative, so we can rewrite this as subtracting a positive number, which is back at the problem that we started with. Now, with all problems like this, we start in the negative area and all of our solutions keep moving towards the negative direction. So we can expect our final answer here to be a negative value. In our fourth scenario, we started with a negative integer and we had that value becoming more positive. Problems like this could include starting at negative 5 and adding 3. To solve this, we start at negative 5 on our number line and we move 3 spots in the positive direction. So it's 1, 2, 3, and we find that our final answer is negative 2. However, you'll notice that if we kept adding more values to it, so if we added 5 for example, we would arrive as a solution of 0. If we added 7, we would move into the positive numbers. So problems of these can have solutions that are negative, positive, but also solutions that equal 0. Now, you probably guessed it, we can rewrite this in another way. It can also be written as starting at negative 5 and then subtracting negative 3. Now, if we refer to rule number 2, subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. So when we're subtracting a negative here, we rewrite this as adding the positive number of 3, which is the same problem that we began with. Now we have identified the 2 key rules and discussed the different scenarios, let's think about a little strategy that can assist us when solving these problems. In our first step, we think about whether we're starting with a positive or a negative value. We can do this by looking at the symbol in front of the first integer. If that has a negative in front of it, then it's going to be a negative value. If it doesn't have a symbol, it means that it's a positive value. In our second step, we need to think about whether we're making it more positive or more negative. This is done by looking at the second integer and applying rules 1 or 2 if necessary. In our third step, it can be good practice to start thinking about if the answer should be positive, negative, or zero. If you do this each time, you will increase your understanding of integers. Now it's time for practice. The best way to improve your skills is with practicing problems. So here are 16 problems to have a go at yourself.